history is a lie. Who were the first victims of the transatlantic slave trade? From colonization and slavery in Central America. Quote, the demand for labor in the early Spanish settlements of Hispaniola, Cuba, Panama, and Peru resulted in a large-scale Indian slave trade in Central America in the second quarter of the 16th century. Indeed, the first colonial economy of the region was based on slave trading. This odious commerce remained the principal colonial economic activity until the decline in population reduced the supply. The export of as many as 500,000 enslaved Indians prior to 1550 contributed to the rapid and severe depopulation of Central America in the 16th century. The subsequent demands for labor, particularly by British woodcutters interloping in Spanish territory in the 18th century, depended on the import of slaves of African origin, chiefly via West Indian markets. End quote. When it comes to the British demand for manpower in the colonies, we have seen in previous videos that indentured servants from the British Isles were in high demand, like these Scottish Jacobites destined to slave away in the Caribbean. This is the original document kept at Harvard University, describing the name and appearance of the Jacobite POWs. In a previous video, we read the transcript and saw that only about 10 to 15% were described as quote-unquote white people, while the vast majority were dark-skinned. From the World's Columbian Exposition at Chicago, published by order of the Venezuelan government, quote, in 1535, the king again decreed that the Caribs should be reduced to bondage. They were to be considered as slaves, used as such, and marked. The zone of the pearl fisheries was extending, and fresh Spanish and Italian adventures were to prey on the wealth extracted from the mollusca. Cubagua was on the wane. Its pearl deposits were disappearing because the Indians, urged by the insatiable cupidity of the conquistadores, had ended by extirpating them. Here is the heart-rending narrative of Bartolomé de las Casas. Hardly had the Indian pearl fishermen issued from the water with a supply of oysters when their masters forced them to dive again without allowing them time to recruit their strength and draw breath. If through sheer necessity the Indian remained above water a few minutes, the master's whip obliged him to dive again. They were fed on the remains of oysters. Occasionally they got some cassave bread, but they never received any wine or strengthening liquor to restore their weakened bodies, which had become covered with scales through the continual contact of salt water. At night, these poor creatures were confined in stocks and loaded with chains so as to preclude any possibility of escape. At dawn, their dreary round of work again began. Many disappeared devoured by sharks. Others would faint away or vomit blood. Most of them died of hunger, cruel treatment, and despair. This was the state of things in Cubagua when Benzoni visited the island in 1542. The Italian sailor thus speaks of this horrible traffic of the first Venezuelan colonists. During our stay in Cubagua, Captain Pedro de Calice arrived with more than 400 slaves he had collected. All these unfortunate beings were almost fainting, either from want of nourishment, excessive labor and fatigue, or from the anguish entailed by separation from country, parents, and children. If some of them, overwhelmed with suffering, were unable to follow the others, the Spaniards, not wishing to leave any behind for fear of some conspiracy, urged them forward with the whip, till some would expire under the blows. It was really pitiful to look upon these wretched creatures, naked, worn out, maimed, hungry, infirm, or crippled. Sorrowing mothers, mourning their misfortunes, were accompanied by 2 or 3 children. All were bound with ropes or chains round the neck and arms. This is the last first-hand account we have the stomach for at the moment. From what we read, Central American Indian slaves were sold, traded, and resold all over America in the Caribbean colonies, even to the North American British and French colonies.